Whispers in the dark. I froze on the sidewalk, breath steaming in the cold night air, when I first heard it. Low, broken whispers curling through the silence like living shadows. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the walls of abandoned buildings and rattling through empty alleyways. My pulse hammered, and my breath caught in my throat. In that moment, I felt certain that I was no longer alone. Midnight in this city is a strange tapestry of flickering neon and overcast gloom. Yet that night, something felt off, as though the streets themselves were breathing. Streetlights buzzed and sputtered, casting pale halos that flickered against the swirling fog. The asphalt glistened beneath the eerie glow, slick from an earlier rain that had left behind dark puddles, reflecting grim facades of graffitied brick and broken windows. Normally, I found some bleak comfort in these silent blocks, but the whispers changed everything. I tried to ignore them at first, chalking it up to my imagination. After all, it wouldn't be the first time I conjured nightmares in my mind. My past has a way of playing tricks on me, especially late at night. Still, even when I stuffed my hands into my pockets and forced myself to keep walking, I heard them. A soft hiss, a fractured phrase. My name, perhaps? I couldn't tell if it was the wind or the echoes of my own conscience unraveling. Fog clung to the narrow alleyways like a living entity. When I glanced sideways, I saw fleeting shapes twisting in the gloom, dark silhouettes that vanished the second I tried to focus on them. A chill ran down my spine. The city's decrepit architecture loomed above me, silent apartment complexes with sagging balconies and boarded-up doors that had once hosted families, dreams, and laughter. Now they were hollow monuments to some unspoken tragedy, skeletons of an era long gone. The stories about these streets go back generations. Growing up, I heard my grandmother warn about the midnight whispers, curses carried by restless spirits doomed to roam the city forever. She said they came from the souls of those who died unjustly, or perhaps from something older than memory itself. As a child, I'd scoffed at such tall tales. But that night, the ghostly murmurs in the fog made me wonder if every legend held a grain of truth. Despite my skepticism, I'd always known I was more vulnerable than others. My father's anger and my mother's tears had left wounds I tried to bury deep. Worse, I had secrets of my own, actions I regretted, words I never should have said. Guilt is a powerful magnet for the supernatural, or so the legends claim. And on that icy night, guilt weighed on me like a shroud, making me a perfect beacon for whatever lurked in the darkness. As I turned onto my usual path home, my heart pounded. The sidewalk stretched ahead like a corridor in some monstrous labyrinth. A single street lamp hummed, flickered, and then snuffed out with a hollow pop. In the instant that followed, I heard it clearly, a voice so faint yet unmistakably human. It rasped my name, Daniel. The sound echoed, dancing through the thick gloom. I almost screamed, but the air in my lungs died on my tongue. I forced my feet to keep moving. My mind churned, desperate for a logical explanation. Perhaps it was a trick of the wind. Maybe kids were playing a prank from behind a dumpster. Or it was just my overworked imagination, fueled by urban legends and childhood fears. Still, my skin prickled with an uncanny certainty that I was wrong. I passed a boarded-up bookstore. Its sign hung askew, the letters half worn away by rain and time. An old memory emerged from the depths of my mind, my grandmother showing me a faded photograph of this very place, taken decades ago when it was thriving. People used to say the bookstore's basement housed occult tomes, objects of sinister power. Rumors, most likely, but the story crawled into my thoughts and refused to let go. My footsteps sounded abnormally loud on the wet concrete, each step amplifying the dread building within me. Then came another whisper, a close conspiratorial sigh brushing against my ear. I spun around. Nobody stood behind me. The streets were empty, as though the entire city had slipped into a dreamless sleep. Except for me. Except for the voice. I couldn't silence the dread blooming in my chest. The stories always said the whispers weren't random. They targeted certain souls, those who carried a certain stain, a curse, or a secret shame. My heart throbbed. Did the voice know about the fight I had with my father the night he died? Did it sense the regret that gnawed at me every time I thought of my mother alone, never knowing the truth of my last, harsh words to him? Wet gusts of wind whistled through the cracks in the buildings. The air smelled of rotting leaves and damp brick, an odor that filled my nostrils with every breath. My shoulders tensed as I inched closer to home. I saw my own reflection in a broken window, pale face haloed by the flicker of a malfunctioning streetlight. For a second I thought I saw another shape behind me, a dark figure with hollow eyes. I spun around again. Nothing. Adrenaline pumped through my veins, making my vision blur at the edges. Short, rapid, breaths. I needed to calm down. My mind raced, reliving my grandmother's warnings. The city's restless ghosts feed on fear. They slip into the cracks of a tormented mind and devour it from within. I thought I'd never believe in such superstitions, yet here I was, sweat slicking my palms, each whisper fracturing my sanity a little more. A distant siren wailed, a forlorn cry echoing through deserted avenues. An old man sat on the stoop of a crumbling brownstone a block ahead, rocking slowly. I hadn't noticed him at first, but now he appeared like a phantom. He wore a tattered coat that hung off his thin shoulders. As I approached, he lifted his head. Under the faint glow of a battered lamp, I saw his eyes, wide, bloodshot, and haunted. "They're hungry tonight," he said, his voice barely above a murmur. His words sent ice through my veins. "You hear them too." I wanted to speak, but my throat closed. He nodded as if he understood. Then he repeated in a hollow monotone, "They're hungry. You should get home." His voice cracked on the last word, as though that single syllable carried the weight of lifetimes. Without waiting for a response, he stood abruptly and slipped back into the brownstone, the door slamming behind him. Silence crashed down around me, broken only by my own ragged breathing. The wind picked up, swirling trash around the stoop, clattering bottles and scraping cardboard against concrete. Then I heard another whisper. Angrier this time, more insistent. I ran. My sneakers splashed across rain-slicked streets. My breath huffed in frantic bursts. I turned corner after corner, half blind in the fog. Streetlights flickered overhead, a strobe of disorienting shadows. Every step seemed to echo with the chanting voices. "Daniel, Daniel, Daniel." With each repetition, the city felt more like a trap, its narrow corridors constricting around me. I couldn't outrun them, couldn't block them out. Finally, I stumbled into my apartment building, a rundown high-rise that towered over the wreckage of smaller, older structures. I jammed my key into the lock and collapsed inside. Behind the door's thin barrier, I leaned against the chipped paint, gulping air. My heart hammered and sweat trickled down my temples. For several moments I just stood there, trying to catch my breath. Then I heard a new sound from within the cramped hallway, a hiss of static coming from my mailbox. The metal mail slot was crammed with junk. Flyers, bills. My mind felt hazy, but something compelled me to reach for a particular envelope, yellowed with age. No return address. Carefully, I opened it. A single photograph fell out, curling at the edges. The image was black and white, depicting the same street I had just been on. Except in this photo, the buildings looked new, and the sidewalks were bustling. In the corner, faintly visible, stood a figure wearing a coat that resembled the old man's. A scribbled date on the back read, 1947. My hands shook. This had to be some sick joke, yet the paper smelled ancient, a scent of dust and forgotten years. Another whisper drifted through the corridor, far too clear. "We know," it said. I retreated into my apartment and locked the door behind me, turning every deadbolt I had. That night, sleep evaded me. I sat on my couch, lights off, staring at the photograph. My mind raced with impossible questions. How could that old man have been alive in 1947, looking exactly the same? Why leave me this photograph now? When dawn finally broke, I felt no relief. The day blurred as I moved through it in a daze. I tried to keep to my routine: coffee, errands, mindless small talk with a neighbor. But the tension never left my chest. The city felt like it was watching me. Every time I stepped out, the shadows in the alleyways seemed to shift. And at the corner of my vision, I swore I caught glimpses of that same figure from the photo, always too quick to vanish. That evening, a chill wind rattled my window. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at an old letter I'd found tucked behind the photograph in the envelope. The handwriting was careful, each letter neatly shaped. "They are drawn to guilt and sorrow. The city's curse runs deep. Do not attempt to fight them. The only way out is to make amends." My stomach twisted. Make amends? My mind flashed back to my father's final moments. The argument that ended with me storming out, slamming the door behind me. He died that night in a car accident. I never had the chance to apologize. Now, guilt clung to me like an open wound, and the city's whispers were feeding on it. Tremors gripped my hands. I needed answers. Some part of me hoped that if I understood the curse, I could break it. So I ventured back outside, compelled by a morbid curiosity. The atmosphere was suffocating. Fog coated every street, and the flickering lights made the city appear in fragments, like snapshots from a nightmare film. The voices returned almost instantly, hushed rasps and guttural sighs that reverberated in my skull. My heart pounded. I sought out old places: the abandoned bookstore, a condemned church with stained glass windows broken like jagged teeth, and finally the city archives building, long defunct, its dusty corridors left to spiders and peeling wallpaper. Legends say the archives hold historical records that the living would rather forget. Whether that was true, I needed to see for myself. The door to the archives was slightly ajar, creaking on rusty hinges. Inside, darkness swallowed me. My flashlight beam caught rows of filing cabinets, each labeled with numbers from a different century. A pungent smell of mold and decaying paper filled the air. Shadows warped along the walls, as though struggling to take shape. And then I heard a disembodied whisper, right behind me. I spun, my flashlight jerking across mounds of scattered files. In a corner, I spotted a row of photographs pinned to a corkboard behind shattered glass. Trembling, I edged closer. The images were old, some dating back to the early 1900s. One picture showed a group of city workers demolishing a row of houses. Another captured a funeral procession. In the corner of each photo stood a faint figure, tall, indistinct, impossible to identify, but somehow reminiscent of the stoop-bound man I'd met. My mouth went dry. I tore one photo off the board, written on the back in spidery handwriting, "A tragedy unforgotten. The city devours the guilty." The building groaned and dust rained from the ceiling. My flashlight flickered. Another whisper. Closer now. Panicked, I started rummaging through scattered documents. Newspaper clippings described mysterious disappearances, old murders, and families driven mad by strange voices. Over and over, the same motif. An unsettling presence that thrived on misery. Some articles even referenced a local legend. The whispers of Forsaken Lane, a curse born from an ancient wrongdoing, hidden by city officials for decades. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. My teeth chattered. Then I saw it, a file containing an account of a mass eviction in the 1940s. Dozens of families forced from their homes, many ended up on the streets. Some died of exposure, others perished in suspicious accidents. A child, orphaned and alone, reportedly cursed the city with her final breath. "Never let them rest," the child was said to have murmured. "Let their guilt become their torment." My vision blurred with tears. This was more than a ghost story. It was a tapestry of sorrow woven into the city's very foundations. That old man, could he be one of the original victims? Or maybe something else entirely, an embodiment of the curse itself? A sudden crash reverberated through the building, snapping me out of my frantic search. The whispering crescendoed, multiple voices overlapping, each speaking in a language of despair. My heart thundered. I fled, clutching the photograph and file, down the corridor, up a flight of rotten stairs. My footsteps pounded in time with the voices, echoing in my ears, short, sharp breaths. Finally, I burst onto the street, nearly colliding with a figure in the fog. I realized it was a woman, no older than me, wrapped in a heavy coat and trembling as if she'd just seen a specter. "They won't stop," she said, voice ragged. "They follow me everywhere." She gazed at me with hollow eyes. "Did you hear them too?" I nodded, my voice trembling. "Yes. They whisper my name. Every night." She pressed her lips together. "I've been trying to leave this place, but something always pulls me back. I think they won't let me go until I face what I've done." I asked what she meant, but her face contorted with pain, as though speaking further might shatter what little composure she had left. She only managed to whisper, "You can't run from your guilt." A gust of wind blasted down the street, stirring scraps of paper and sending them spiraling through the damp air. The woman disappeared into the haze. I was alone again, haunted by her final words. The city pulsed with a sinister life, each alley a corridor of secrets. Every flicker of a streetlight threatened to reveal a new horror. My mind churned. The voices were linked to guilt, tragedy, and old curses. Could my own regret be feeding this malevolent force? If so, how could I possibly atone for something that can never be undone? I wandered aimlessly, eventually returning to my apartment. Exhaustion weighed on me like lead. I collapsed on my couch, the photograph and files spread out on my coffee table. Memories of my father surged forward, his laughter, the proud way he once looked at me, and the anger in his eyes the night we argued. My stomach twisted with remorse. Clenching my teeth, I whispered into the darkness, "I'm sorry." My voice echoed, a feeble attempt at absolution. Then the lights flickered and the walls themselves seemed to breathe. A wave of whispers cascaded through the room, skittering along the edges of my consciousness. They grew louder, more insistent. Each breath felt like shards of ice slicing through my lungs. My vision dimmed, and I thought I saw a figure lurking by my bedroom door, a shape that flickered in and out of existence. I blinked, and the shape was gone. Fear coiled in my gut. Suddenly, a violent pounding rattled my door. In the hallway, I heard the old man's voice, words muffled but heavy with accusation. "Face them, or they will consume you." Terror shot through me. My heart pounded against my ribs. I stood, knees shaking, and approached the door. My trembling fingers unlatched the locks. Outside, only swirling fog greeted me. Yet, as I peered down the corridor, I saw faint outlines drifting through the gloom, a line of shadows, as if an entire crowd was shuffling toward me, their mutters swelling into a ghostly chant. I staggered backward. The chanting escalated, throbbing in my head, each voice a thread of anguish and fury. These were the souls of the forgotten, the cast aside, the cursed. Suddenly, a heavy force slammed into me and I fell, knocking over a lamp. Darkness enveloped the room. My head spun, and I let out a ragged cry. Short, staccato, words, terrified. I was suffocating in the blackness. I crawled to the coffee table, fumbling for the photograph. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating my living room in a stark silver glare. In that brief flash, I saw them. Dozens of figures standing behind my couch, translucent shapes with hollow eyes, arms outstretched as if beckoning me to join them. My scream lodged in my throat. I forced myself to speak through chattering teeth. "I'm sorry. I never meant to..." The words caught in my mouth. Another flash of lightning, and the figures vanished. The whispers remained, swirling around me like vengeful specters. My mind teetered on the edge of sanity. Guilt, regret, despair. They had me in their claws, and I could feel them tightening their grip. I closed my eyes. "I accept it," I whispered. The truth poured out. I apologized for my anger, for my cowardice, for every terrible thing I'd done, and every chance at kindness I'd let slip. For a moment, the silence stretched thin, like a wound about to be torn open. Then a single whisper broke through. "Daniel." My eyes shot open. The old man stood over me, intangible but undeniably present. His face bore the weight of centuries. "The city listened," he rasped. "Now you must listen too." A high-pitched wail split the air, and the windows rattled. I huddled on the floor, arms wrapped around my head, eyes squeezed shut. The temperature plummeted, and a gale-force wind blasted through the apartment. When I risked a glance, the old man was gone. In his place hovered a child's silhouette, hair matted, eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. She spoke without moving her lips, her voice a chorus of lost souls. "We died in the cold. Our homes were taken, our voices ignored." She gazed at me, accusing and forlorn. "Now, we are bound here." Tears slid down my cheeks. I'm so sorry," I stammered, though no apology could ever mend the horrors done to them. Still, I sensed that this was what they craved: recognition, remorse, a spark of empathy from the living. My heart thudded so loudly I thought it would burst. A sudden whoosh of air pressed me to the floor. My ears rang with otherworldly shrieks. Then, just as quickly, the wind subsided. In the hush that followed, the shadows faded from my vision. The oppressive weight on my chest lifted, though not completely. A residue of dread lingered, as though the city's curse still held some sway over me. I lay there for a long time, drifting between exhaustion and fear, until the first pale light of dawn filtered through the dirty windows. Slowly, I pulled myself upright. The photograph lay on the floor, edges bent from the turmoil. I picked it up, gaze lingering on the old street, the figure in the corner. My reflection stared back from the glossy surface, superimposed over the specter of decades past. Epilogue isn't the right word for what happened next, because nothing truly ended. The voices didn't vanish, not completely. They still call my name in the hush of night, though quieter now, more of a distant echo than a violent intrusion. Sometimes I hear them in the rustling of leaves, or in the static between radio stations, a constant reminder of the city's unresolved sorrow. I've tried to do what I can. I volunteer at shelters, speak out against the injustices that continue to plague these streets. Maybe it's just a way to soothe my own conscience, but I cling to the hope that every bit of empathy can dispel a fraction of the darkness. And in these small acts, I sense a subtle shift, like the city's very bones sighing, their pain fractionally eased. Still, late at night, when fog swallows the blocks and the streetlights flicker with that nauseating hum, I feel them watching. Sometimes I glimpse the old man on a stoop, nodding once before disappearing. Other times I see the child's reflection in puddles, eyes aglow with ancient grief. And always, I hear the whispers. Sometimes they say my name in tones of hollow warning. Other times they recite words I cannot understand, a language older than memory, carried on the wind that seeps through the crumbling mortar of our city's foundations. Each time I wonder if they'll drag me into their realm, an endless labyrinth of regret and sorrow. Each time I remind myself that I've made my choice to stay, to try to heal what little I can. The city's scars run deep. The tragedy that birthed the curse lingers, fused to every broken building and graffiti-stained wall. The decaying architecture stands as a silent testament to ghosts that refuse to move on. Yet, in a strange way, that unquiet presence is also what keeps me here. It forces me to remember what I tried so hard to forget, compelling me to acknowledge that I am part of the city, just as guilty, just as haunted. Every night, when darkness settles and fog creeps in, I brace myself. The unsettled whispers begin again, weaving through the corridors and scuttling across rooftops. A faint hiss in my ear. Daniel. Sometimes I close my eyes and exhale, letting the terror wash over me in staccato bursts of panic. Other times I stand at my window and stare down at the deserted streets, letting the hush of the city's sorrow fill me until I can't breathe. Because the truth is, there is no neat conclusion. The curse is ancient, the guilt immeasurable. The city remains caught in the tension between what was and what should have been, and I remain trapped with it, listening, atoning, trembling. On certain nights, I even sense a kind of acceptance from the lingering ghosts, as if they're waiting to see if my remorse can somehow tip the scales and give them a moment's peace. Then, before dawn breaks, they recede. The child's voice echoes one last time, reminding me that tomorrow night will bring the same haunting, the same test of conscience. Her final words always are a whisper that skitters down my spine. Never forget. And I don't, because to forget would mean letting the past repeat its horrors, letting more souls be devoured by injustice and apathy. So I remain, heart pounding, mind racing, ears straining for that first murmur in the thick night air. It comes, inevitably, as an intangible breath of wind through the cracked cityscape, calling my name. And I never know if I'll have the strength to answer without losing what's left of my sanity. So, I wait, in the cold, under flickering lights, in the oppressive fog, listening to the whispers in the dark, hoping that one day they'll forgive me, or at least let me carry their story forward, so the city no longer turns a deaf ear to its own ghosts. If I vanish before that day comes, perhaps someone else will hear the echoes and wonder, what are those voices in the wind? Why does the city groan with sorrow at midnight? And maybe they'll feel the same nameless dread creeping into their heart, compelling them to seek the hidden truth. If so, they'll learn what I've learned. They'll find themselves standing at the threshold of shadows, forced to face their darkest regrets. And the city will continue to whisper, long after my footprints vanish from the broken sidewalks and my voice fades into the hush of memory. Those voices will linger, because some curses cling to the soul of a place, binding the living to the dead, turning every sigh of wind into a reminder. In this city of restless spirits and flickering lights, no one escapes the darkness without confronting the deepest corners of their heart. I can only hope my own admission of guilt is enough to pacify them, at least for tonight. Yet, as I stand in front of my cracked window, listening to the distant murmur of voices that no rational mind should ever hear, I can't help but wonder, are these whispers truly from an age-old curse? Or are they the echoes of my own hidden shame, finally forcing me to see myself for who I am? The question remains unanswered. The city's hush persists. My name floats on the wind, half-formed, a sound caught between heartbreak and accusation. And I shudder, uncertain if I should be relieved or terrified, to realize that the line between reality and myth has grown so thin. I'm not sure there ever was a line at all. In the end, no conclusion comforts me. My last thought each night is of that old photograph, an instant frozen in time, proof that the city's secrets are older than I am, older than any of us. And though I can't say what horror might unfold tomorrow, I can say this with unsteady certainty. I will be here to hear the whispers in the dark until they decide I've paid my dues, or until they claim me entirely.